Hi, everyone. It's journalist Lisa Ling, and I'm sure you will agree that it is so important for there to be good, trustworthy journalism on children and families, and nobody does that better than the Imprint. I am such a devotee of the Imprint, and I listen to the Imprint Weekly podcast because it is so comprehensive and so substantive, and it is by far the best news source for anyone interested in critical issues like foster care, juvenile justice, youth homelessness, and so much more. During this holiday season of giving, I hope you'll consider donating to the Imprint. If you do so between now and the end of the year, your donation will be doubled thanks to the National Newsmatch campaign. To give is so easy. Go to imprintnews.org/donate. That's imprintnews.org/donate. Thank you so much.
Hello and welcome to the Imprint Weekly Podcast. I'm John Kelly, Senior Editor of the Imprint, a daily news site covering child welfare and youth justice around the country. You can read all of our coverage at imprintnews.org or check us out on Facebook or Twitter at the Imprint News. You can also sign up on our homepage for our free weekly and monthly newsletters. And for professionals in child welfare and youth justice, subscribe to our Youth Services Insider section for a closer look at news on business policy and practice. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is also a member of the Safe Camp Audio Network. You can check out our show page and all of Safe Camp's other great podcasts at safecampaudio.org on the web or at safecampaudio on social media. On today's episode, we talked to journalist Nell Bernstein, who is a frequent contributor to the Imprint, definitely part of the Imprint extended family here, about her new book, In Our Future We Are Free, The Dismantling of the Youth Prison, which explores the driving factors behind the decades-long decline in the number of kids who are incarcerated and the number of youth prisons that they're incarcerated in. This is Bernstein's third book. In 2005, she wrote All Alone in the World, which is about kids of incarcerated parents. And then in 2014, she wrote Burning Down the House, which focused on the harsh realities and abuses that occur inside of youth prisons. She's also started her own Substack, which is also called In Our Future We Are Free. I will drop the link in our show notes for people that want to subscribe to that. I'll tell you right now, it's nellbernstein.substack.com, not complicated. We talked about the new book with Nell and her past work and what she thinks about the current climate and youth justice. So that's all coming for you. Before we get to that interview, since we didn't do a traditional headlines last week, I thought I'd quickly highlight just a few things of interest on the Imprint website recently. As always, the links will be in our show notes if you want to read further, as I will just be scratching the surface of some of the great reporting that our folks do here. Most of these relate to the government shutdown and its impact on families, kids, and on the child welfare system. So on last month's headlines, I mentioned that, big federally funded programs like the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, also called food stamps, or Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, that's sort of the federal welfare program. Those are exposed in a shutdown because they no longer are presently funded, right? Once the federal fiscal year ends and we don't have a deal on the table or even a continuing resolution, there's technically no money for those. Now, the federal government might have some funds left over from previous fiscal years to distribute, or states might have not spent down all that they have currently, amassed in one of those buckets. But eventually, if a shutdown keeps going, those things will run out. And we've never really, this is now the record setter as far as government shutdowns go. So we're kind of in uncharted territory. Now, I think most people listening probably are aware that SNAP has become kind of one of the focal points of the shutdown, alongside pay for government employees, especially troops, and all the changes that are taking place at the airports and limitations on flights and things like that. So in the case of SNAP's normal funding has basically been exhausted, and we are now in a kind of court standoff about whether the Trump administration has to use emergency resources available to it to keep the program going. Most recently, I think over the weekend, the Supreme Court halted a lower court's ruling that the Trump administration would have to fully fund SNAP through emergency funds, and the Trump administration was trying to, in response to a previous court order to use the emergency money available to it, trying to only pay out limited or capped amount of their SNAP obligations. And then this other court had basically said, no, you got to fully fund it. The Supreme Court now put that on hold. And I guess we'll have a decision at some point soon, maybe, who knows? And then there's also the possibility that even by the time that you listen to this podcast on the week I release it here, this will all be over and there'll be a deal and the government will open them back up again. So our reporters in New York and Colorado, Minnesota, Georgia, and California fanned out to local food banks and other community programs to get a sense from organizers and from people waiting sometimes in very long lines about where families stand more than a month into this shutdown. And here's one scene from our coverage that really captures sort of how the stress has mounted over the past week of this shutdown. This is from Colorado. Jay Wissington is the director of the food bank at Forge Ministries, another provider about 3 blocks away. She said she didn't start seeing the impact of the government shutdown until Wednesday. The food bank had been operating business as usual since the shutdown started, but now they are feeding 3 times the amount of people they normally do. And I'm quoting here from Wissington in the story. When I was on food stamps, I was spending it left and right thinking it's going to be there next week. And because this is the longest time that the government has been shut down, I think a lot of this response is fear. And here is from Nancy Marie Spears reporting on the impact of the SNAP cuts and other things on tribes. The Sault Ste. Marie of Chippewa Indians, the largest tribe east of the Mississippi, is projecting a 30% to 40% increased burden on its tribal commodities program because many citizens rely on the SNAP benefits slated to be paused. The outcome will be dire, predicts Councilmember Aaron Payment. Quote, we're going to run out of food, end quote. Another family-focused program impacted by the shutdown has been Head Start, which is a key piece of the child care and early childhood infrastructure in this country. The National Head Start Association says that more than 100 Head Start programs serving more than 60,000 kids in 41 states are operating without federal funds right now, and that means they are doing so on the margin in the faith that the tap gets turned back on here eventually. Now, here's a piece of reporting from this from Jordan Anderson, our reporter in Georgia. I'm reading from her story. Overlooking the playground activity last week, Donna Davidson, CEO of Easter Seals North Georgia, expressed relief. The Head Start programs her nonprofits run are open due to an emergency loan. Across the state, Head Start programs serving more than 500 children in more rural parts of the state have had to close because of the ongoing federal government shutdown. And I'm quoting Davidson here from the story. These are our children. We care deeply about what happens to them. At the end of the day, families are the collateral damage of all this. It's not right. So again, those are, predominantly federally funded items, SNAP, TANF, Head Start, and they did not last long during the shutdown before, funds ran out. Now we're seeing some early signs also that more general state operations are going to feel the pinch pretty soon here. Some more Georgia reporting from Jordan Anderson. She broke the news last week that the state's child welfare agency, which is called the Division of Family and Children's Services, had begun to gatekeep on some pretty basic child welfare services aimed at preventing foster care or promoting reunification. And this was attributed directly to the federal shutdown. So they didn't exactly just halt and completely suspend, the ability of their local offices to conduct those services or pay for them. But they put the clamps down on it. Let's basically call it that. You have to go and seek permission from the state at this point to get a lot of those services unlocked. Now, there might be some debate within the state of Georgia around if that really needs to happen or not. Georgia is a kind of rare state with a very healthy surplus, but I would not be surprised if we start to hear about more shutdown-related actions in states, which could come in the form of halting federal program access like Head Start and TANF, limiting actions like Georgia's taking here, which is general services, or in furloughing or laying off state workers whose salaries are either derived fully or in part from federal cash. And that, I say that the child welfare system is particularly exposed to this because as you look at sort of the outlay of how child welfare services are paid for in this country, the majority is at that local level between counties and cities and then the state. But it is something on the order of 40% of dollars that come from the federal government to pay for a lot of different child welfare services. So all the links to that coverage that I just described will be in the show notes here. You can also go to our White House Watch collection page on our homepage at imprintnews.org and get all that and much more. Last thing, and stepping mostly away from the shutdown here, Alex Adams was recently confirmed by the Senate to lead the Administration for Children and Families. That's sort of the top spot in child welfare policy within the federal government. That person oversees, funding for foster care and adoption, but also lots of family services, elderly services, the very rapidly growing, for a time, unaccompanied minors program within the Office of Refugee Resettlement, things like that. So the Imprint managed to get our hands on a letter that he sent out to state child welfare leaders that gave some pretty general indications, at least, of some priorities going forward here for the administration. Just to call a few of those out here, things that he identified in that letter: accelerating evidence-based prevention services. I'm going to assume that really refers to the menu of options cleared for use under the Family First Prevention Services Act. Recruitment and retention of foster families, speeding up the time to permanency for kids who are eligible for adoption, improving outcomes for youth who are aging out of foster care, increased access to high quality, affordable childcare, including Head Start, and breaking generational cycles of poverty by promoting upward mobility. Now, in addition to that, he took some paragraphs at the end of his message to get a little spicy about one issue where he said his Administration for Children and Families will not be a partner to states, and that is on the benefits owed to some foster youth through the Social Security system. And I'll read here a little bit from that letter. He called states out on the, quote, diversion of earned Social Security and other survivor benefits from foster children to offset state costs, end quote. Now, we have talked about this with several guests on the podcast, and I'll drop some interviews for people that want to kind of bone up on this topic, but I'm just going to just very generally summarize it here. There are many states out there who will, basically screen kids who are in foster care to see whether they're eligible for certain benefits related to their status as a survivor if a parent has died, or if they have a disability that rises to the level of having them be eligible for SSI benefits. And then states will often make themselves the payee on those benefits. Now, that is technically allowable within the law, but what is not allowable, or that people are highly critical of, including Adams apparently, is using that money to simply just sort of offset the cost of them being in foster care. That money is really supposed to be set aside for specific, personal, individualized use by the children in real time, or at the very least saved for their future. So again, he calls out that practice and then continues by saying, I will actively and expeditiously work to curb this abusive practice to ensure vulnerable youth have the resources they need to succeed. So we'll see what he means by that. I do think also it's worth calling out, so when he was running Idaho's system, they did change their policy to completely wall off and protect Social Security benefits to foster youth, but their policy was really focused on survivors. And so that is one faction, the children who are owed those benefits because their parent died. It could be that there's more of a focus on that and less of a focus on kids who are eligible for benefits as a result of their own disabilities. But that will be something that we will see as, the Adams tenure starts. Obviously, he sort of got into this job and was confirmed only to have a lot of his staff home because of the shutdown. Adams also continued something that his predecessor, Andrew Grattison, who had served as interim director of ACF for a while there, had begun, and that was a series of instructions to some states that seem to threaten financial consequences if they don't change their policies, setting affirmation of gender identity as a requirement in the foster care licensing practice. So these letters that went out to several states basically explained the administration's views that qualified foster parents who refuse to accept the gender identity expressed by a child are being barred, quote, solely because they cannot in good conscience commit to affirming a hypothetical child's gender identity. Goes on to kind of espouse the view of the administration that families who are ready and able to provide loving, stable homes should be supported, not sidelined. by the systems created to protect children. Policies that elevate ideology or politics above the best interest of children must be corrected without delay. And so the letter then instructs state officials to, and I'm quoting here from it, provide written response outlining how you will review and, where necessary, amend policy to bring them into alignment with these values and applicable laws. Now, this is a kind of an interesting ground here because there are several lawsuits and legal challenges, constitutional ones, around the country around this very issue of basically requiring that in order to obtain a license to be a foster parent, you must say that you are going to affirm whatever gender ideology that a child in your care says they have. And I think that we've talked about this on the podcast before. It seems to me that this is going to be some pretty tough terrain for the Supreme Court because it basically is seeking for them to, on some level, kind of like define what affirmation it means or what it means to be affirming. I do think that those cases might even gotten into some interesting ground around, the role of relatives and where relatives stand relative to foster parents in this way or whatever. These letters, my read is that they're sort of trying to get ahead of these cases and see if they can really lean on states to just get away from policies that hold out the affirmation clauses as a requirement to get licensed. And my guess is that there will be several states that push back and don't want to change their policies just because of this letter from the Trump administration. So I think this is something that we've published on already at the Imprint. Our reporter Michael Fitzgerald did a great job pulling together the letters that had been sent out to these states and explaining this. So I'm going to drop a link to his coverage in the show notes here, and you can definitely stay tuned. I don't think that will be the last time that we visit this topic. All right, we're going to take a quick break, and then we'll be right back with our conversation with journalist and author Nell Bernstein.
Are you a professional in the field of child welfare, juvenile justice, or other family and youth services? Subscribe today to Youth Services Insider, the Imprint's exclusive section on all the insider news you need to stay in the know. Funding opportunities, major federal and state policy shifts, interviews with key leaders in the field. It's all available only for our Youth Services Insider subscribers. Sign up for a monthly or yearly subscription today by visiting imprintnews.org/subscribe. Our podcast listeners get 10% off their subscription by entering the promo code podcast10. That's imprintnews.org/subscribe and get 10% off your subscription by entering the promo code podcast10 today.
All right, we are joined today by Nell Bernstein, occasional journalist for the Imprint and author of the new book, In Our Future We Are Free, The Dismantling of the Youth Prison, which is her third book and second completely about youth justice in America. Nell, thanks for joining us on the Imprint Weekly podcast.
It's great to be here.
House rules on our podcast before we get into the weighty issues of youth justice and child welfare and all the things we talk about. We try to get to know just a little bit about you guys that we are talking to. So I'm going to ask you to give me one favorite, at least in these categories. You can give me more than that if you want, Nell, but here they are: TV show or movie, book, musical group, or sports team. Just got to give me one favorite in those groups. Nell, what do you got for the people?
So I think if you really want to understand crime and how to advance public safety, you need to watch Slow Horses.
Okay. I did not make. Okay. I actually watched 2 episodes of Slow Horses.
So. I'm being a little facetious, but it is far and away the best show on TV. And it turns out that all you need to do to keep a city safe and thwart horrific terrorist attacks is be Gary Oldman drunk all the time, acting stupid, but secretly knowing more than everything in the room. Amazing. So I think if we could all just be Gary Oldman, we wouldn't even have a crime problem in this country.
So do you think you're the first person in history to write multiple books about youth justice?
I mean, that's a great question.
I'm trying to think, and I can't think of anybody that has written more than one book about youth justice. I think you might. You've written 2.5 because your first book was also At least
Yeah,
that, yeah.
I think you might be right because Liz Ryan has been posting books related to youth justice all month for Youth Justice Action Month. I don't think there's anyone else. And you know what? When you pitch a book, the publisher always wants to know about comps. What are other books on related topics that have sold or even exist? We couldn't find any comps for this. The last comp that came up was Burning Down the House, which I published 10 years ago. So yeah, I do think it's an underexplored subject.
Indeed. Speaking of burning down the house, why don't you just like let's start out with this. So you wrote Burning Down the House 10 years ago. What is the difference between the two for readers who or for our listeners who might want to go back and read it? It was obviously a slightly different time in our history, but what is the fundamental difference between what you did in that book and what you're trying to do here in the new one?
Yeah, I mean, I think aside from the topic, they're completely different. Burning down the house was a reported argument against the practice of putting children in prison. And when I say youth prison, I mean the large state-run prison-like facilities. It was grounded mostly in either visits I had made to these institutions or stories young people who'd been inside them told me. And honestly, I wrote that book in a sort of white heat of rage at what I had seen. So looking back on it, I think it's a little polemical, a little preachy in places. So in this book, uh, which is a much more hopeful story of the very successful movement away from youth incarceration. I did try to take myself out of it and really just give the stage to the incredible activists and advocates who made this change happen. And the other big difference is that, to my own great surprise, I've written a very hopeful book about youth justice.
I think that's how I would have described it too. I think that Burning Down the House was less reported, right? Like it was an argument based on your experience as a reporter, what you believed to be true, and this was more explanatory and reported about how things happen. Because I think Burning Down the House occurred, it wasn't like that was the starting point or we hadn't gotten off the ground yet with people trying to close down youth prisons. But certainly a lot of that has happened since. And I think that this is more of a historical look at all the things that have gone into why these large, in particular, large youth prisons have closed. Is that fair to say?
Mostly, I'm going to be mildly defensive and say I did do
Please.
a lot of reporting for Burning Down the House. I spent a lot of time interviewing young people who had been through these institutions, and I also had an incredible researcher working with me. His
Yeah.
name is Will Roy. He now runs a remarkable reentry program in the Bay Area, but he'd spent 6 years in the Youth Authority and did some really profound interviews also with young people. So yeah, it was reported, but it also included a lot of my own experience because I've been working with young people involved in the youth justice system since the late 90s. So I told those stories too. And yeah, a lot more of just me kind of ranting about how outrageous. I really tried quite hard to dial that back this time around.
Now, having been a reporting witness, a journalist in this space, seeing the closure of many youth prisons, what do you believe to be most causal or essential to it happening? Having had a front row seat like you have, I mean, you've written in this book about the parent activism that's pushed for it, youth voice being elevated over these decades, inside reformers working kind of in the machine and the politics. Is there any common core, I don't know, thing that needs to be present, having looked back at this history for
Yes.
these things to close? And what is that?
Yeah. So on the one hand, as you said, it was sort of a everything everywhere all at once approach, which I think is true of any social movement. But when I think about the through lines, here's what I think. I think that prisons, including youth prisons, maybe especially youth prisons, depend on two things to survive: dehumanization and invisibility. There's just no way that we could do the things we do to children inside these places if A, we saw Black and brown children as fully human as any other child, and if the public knew what was going on in them. These places are sited in remote rural areas not only to provide jobs, which is the explanation that you usually hear, but also because
It's easier to hide it if it's in the middle of the night.
absolutely. So you might drive down 5 and see some razor wire off in the distance and just not really think about it the way you would if it was on the edge of your city. A reporter, it's really hard to get inside these places, especially in California, which has a Manson era law saying that reporters can't ask for interviews with individual prisoners, allegedly because people like him had groupies, but they use it to enhance that invisibility. Even family members, when they go to visit their kids, and there's all kinds of barriers to that, don't get past a very tightly controlled visiting room. So what's actually happening on the units where young people live is obscured from view. So I think that the first job of any activist, and it began with incarcerated youth themselves, is to pierce that veil of invisibility and make it so that we just can't look away from what we're doing.
We'll talk about some of the challenges in replacing mass incarceration in a second here for kids anyway. But what's your sense of how many of these big youth prisons are truly left in the country? Do you think, all challenges and risk of backsliding that exist, in different aspects of youth justice, do you think the idea of building a brand new, 100 to 200 plus person youth prison is pretty well done with? Or do you still worry that that could come back?
So just to kind of bookmark the progress that we've made, youth incarceration is down 75% from its 2000 height, and at least 2/3 of these institutions have closed. It's been a while since there was an accounting, so I'm going to guess it's more. That said, we are in a moment of, at the very least, rhetorical backlash. We're hearing language not just out of DC, but from local DAs, from state legislators, that's very reminiscent of the dehumanizing super predator language that we heard in the 90s. So I'm optimistic. I think the progress that has been made will be hard to undo. And I think the movement infrastructure that's been built up over the past 25 years is also formidable. But look around us. I would never say at this moment in our country's history, no, we absolutely can't go backwards.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I guess, and just to share my 2 cents, I do. I think rhetorical backlash is a great way to say what's happened thus far, and I will account for there have been definite, concrete legislative backlashes or rollbacks in a couple of states, including Louisiana. But I guess and I kind of thought about this as I was reading your book. I feel like there's a very good chance that we could see at least legislation start to get introduced more vociferously here across the country, especially after what's happened with the increased National Guard presence in DC and things. I think that you could start to see a lot more introduced legislation around transferring kids, adult time for adult crime concepts, a lot of things that would involve kids in criminal court. I'm more optimistic. I guess I share your optimism that it would be very hard to sell building huge youth prisons. Like,
Agreed. And yeah, you're 100% right about where the backlash is. I've actually written a couple stories about this for the Imprint.
yeah, yeah.
And it's pretty interesting because as youth prisons have closed over time, the fear has always been that if judges don't have that quote unquote tough option, they would send more kids into the adult system. The reverse has happened. The number of kids transferred and tried as adults has dropped by 80% over the same
Mm-hmm.
period. So we're definitely seeing a sea change in the big picture in how we see and treat kids and how we understand what keeps us safe. That said, it's fascinating to me, and not in a good way, that what concrete backlash we've seen has been a return to trying more kids as adults, because that was the signature move of the super predator era. So we had the super predator language, and now the language coming out of DC is all about gangs and hordes and mobs of youth. So very de-individualizing. And the whole purpose, as you know, of a separate juvenile justice system was theoretically this idea that we would treat each kid as an individual. So we've got language that's collectivizing youth of color, and then we've got efforts in DC and, as you said, in several states, as well as in various counties with DAs to return more kids to the adult system.
Yeah.
But, I don't think we're going to undo an 80% drop, but it's troubling. And in terms of youth incarceration, something interesting to the numbers since I sort of got the first hard copy of the book. If you look at a chart of youth incarceration over time from 2000 to 2022, which were the last numbers I had when I wrote the book, it is a slow, steady, unbroken drop. There's not a single zig or zag. And then between 2022 and 2023, it ticks up again. So that's a very small number, but it's the first time in 25 years that's happened. So I agree with you. I don't think we're going to build new youth prisons. My fear, honestly, is that those that have been closed and not repurposed will end up holding immigrants. But, I think as with any civil or human rights movement, you can never say we did it, we're done, we're safe now.
Yeah, well, but I kind of stepped on the beginning of my questions. I asked you, do you think, looking forward to the future, but how many of these the large youth prisons are you aware of that exist? The ones that come to mind for me that are still out there, I believe, are the ones in Wisconsin, because that seems to be in the way of them doing other reforms. But they have two pretty big ones. But I just not I can't think of any others now that California has essentially shuttered some of the biggest youth prisons we have.
So I'm going to have to look at my numbers there to make sure I get it right. But most states do still have one or more large youth prisons. Many, many fewer than in the past, but they still exist. Wisconsin is an interesting example because they passed a law years ago saying that they were going to close prison because of horrific abuse revelations, and they just haven't done it. But these places still exist. There's just a lot fewer of them.
Yeah, it's amazing how this just seems very youth policy-ish, and just speaks to the lack of attention that this stuff gets. That this seems to happen quite a bit, where there's just this consensus that something is terrible or bad, at least, and needs to happen, and then it just drags on for years. Like in Wisconsin with these two, I know one's called Lincoln Hills, I can't remember the name of the other, and or in like Los Angeles, where you've got facilities that just basically just been rated unlivable, where kids still are.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, California is really a cautionary tale. I call the chapter on California How Not to Close a Prison.
Yeah, let's that's a good segue to that, because California is just a really interesting part of this book, and some of the reporting that you've done for us in the past couple of years. And it just appears that if nothing else changes, the state's withdrawal from youth incarceration has led to possibly worse incarceration at a local level. So you can walk listeners through, don't ruin the book for them, but give them the skinny on kind of what's been going down in California.
Yeah, so for context, I look at a number of states in the book. In places like New York and Washington, D.C., the coalition that came together to close these institutions, first of all, included people like Vinnie Schiraldi in DC, as you know, or Gladys Carrion in New York, who were running the systems with the express intent of closing them. And in most states, there has been an effort to lay the groundwork before you close these places down so that there's some alternative when a judge decides a kid needs to be locked up. In California, that's not what happened. In 2020, the pandemic hit. Newsom looked at the budget and was afraid there was going to be a large shortfall. Didn't happen. But he literally just zeroed out the budget for the Department of Juvenile Justice. It was on page 23 of the newspapers. It was the quietest closure of what was
Yeah,
once.
that's true.
And the preparation hadn't been done. So this crazy thing happened, which I have written about for the Imprint. The legislature had to rush to pass a law to implement Newsom's budget decision. In any case, the legislature passed a law to implement this closure. And, Newsom had been talking for years about ending youth incarceration as we know it and reimagining juvenile justice. So we passed this beautiful law saying that rather than being in these state youth prisons, which would no longer exist, young people would be in trauma-informed, culturally sensitive, home-like therapeutic environments. But again, nobody did the planning and nobody invested the money. So what's happened in California is that in every single county, the therapeutic home-like, et cetera, placement has been inside a county juvenile hall, which is basically, when I say youth prison, I'm talking about a state-run facility. Juvenile halls are just youth jails. They're meant for short-term, largely pretrial detention. They have even less outdoor space than the state facilities. They have very little programming. They're just not meant for kids to spend years and years in. But that's what's been happening. And you mentioned LA, which is, kind of a catastrophe of almost unimaginable scale. LA historically sent more kids than anyone else by far to the state youth prisons. And at this point, every single one of their juvenile detention facilities has been declared unfit for habitation by children by the quite conservative Board of State and Community Corrections. Yet kids are still there. I think 50 guards were indicted at Los Padrinos for being involved in gladiator fights, which was a hallmark of the worst years of the state system. Kids are dying of overdoses. Staff are administering Narcan day after day. Staffing is incredibly low. So kids are locked in their cells all day. All the things that led to the closure of the state system in Los Angeles are now happening at the county level. So really, I will say that since I finished the book, some counties have come up with really certainly well-intentioned and often good efforts to quote unquote step down young people from detention, but it's a county by county thing. And in some counties, they're just back where they were 20 years ago. But yeah, as Frankie Guzman put it, they're just in dungeons closer to home.
So would you, I mean, having reported on this and talked to people like Frankie and everybody else, I mean, is your sense that we would have been better off in a world where there were a few California youth, state facilities left? Because I guess if you're just saying one dungeon versus another, and your view is that both of them essentially were that, I guess you could make the case that it would be better at least to be close to family that could see you more, right?
I mean, I think that I have heard a couple of advocates make that argument. That, for example, the Prison Law Office, which sued what was then called the California Youth Authority, felt like they had made a lot of progress on conditions and introduced a fair number of services at the state level. So there is an argument that kids are worse off in county detention, but it's a really tricky thing to say, we're going to screw this up so badly that we should leave these kids in these institutions with a history of abject torture. Like, I just don't think we get to say we're going to get this so wrong that we should probably just leave them in these places. We should get it right. And it's not too late.
You end the book with a section that first hones in on, the work of the Young Women's Freedom Center, Ubuntu Village, a few other community leaders and programs, which are doing things like reentry support or broad spectrum, community empowerment. And then that last section, I really like the historical callback that you did to that first big missed prediction on youth justice, right? A lot of people remember the super predator one, but it's the, researcher basically just saying nothing works as ways to reform or avoid prison when it comes to youth. And, a lot of subjects in the book are really make the case in that last section that it's this population level improvement on things like people having food and less poverty and more opportunities for youth in communities that are what's needed. Do you think there's a system, a community, a county that you would look to and say, like, this is the place that really gets this and is at least trying to view systemic reform, with that in mind?
Okay. That's an interesting question. I think there are organizations, community organizations, including many that are led by formerly incarcerated people that are trying to do it. I think places, the Bay Area is one of them, where there are a lot of those organizations. I don't think there is a count, and there are counties that are trying, right? But here's a fundamental problem that, again, some of the advocates who worked in the system were very clear on. If you've got a bunch of services, recreation, mental health, educational support, drug treatment, whatever it is, and those services are being administered by probation, no matter how good your intentions are, what you have, as I think Gladys Carrion put it, is a parallel universe for young people of color. And that resonates with me as a parent. The last chapter is called Everything Works. I think, like any parent, I want everything for my kids. Do I want it to flow through a coercive, stigmatizing public system? No. And do I want it to be offered to them in the name of prevention? I don't think anybody wants to be seen as a crime waiting to happen. So I think there are efforts that are partial at best, but I just think it's so profoundly true. And this is something that Candace Jones, who's now the head of the Public Welfare Foundation, but headed the youth justice system in Illinois, said, which is we know exactly what crime prevention and a safe neighborhood looks like. It looks like a well-to-do white neighborhood where you've got good schools, ample services, parks, playgrounds, sport. That's what everyone needs. Now, how to get there? I don't think that's a problem that can be solved by the system. That is a huge society level problem.
I think that's you just nailed it right there. I mean, the triangulation is that it will take government, but not the system. And so how do you get the synergy and the resources flowing from government to the type of people that you describe in those chapters without involving the criminal justice system in that dynamic, you know?
I mean, you're asking that question at such a tough moment. It looks like millions of people are going to lose their food stamps. We've talked, and I've written for you about the massive federal defunding of community-based violence intervention programs. The whole social safety net is under attack right now. So how do you get government to solve this problem? Wow. A revolution? It's a challenging question right now. Because really what it's about is, and I know this is going to sound, I don't know, pie in the sky, but as long as we have the kind of racism that's entrenched in this country, as long as we have the levels of inequality that are only increasing in this country, it's going to be very difficult to get to the place where we understand public safety as a matter of investing in all children.
Yeah.
So I wish I had an answer.
Yeah, it's tough. Those last two chapters, I did want to ask you about one thing that was kind of not as much in there. In your view of, the role of alternatives to incarceration, it kind of felt like you're skeptical of them having a big role for more targeted efforts to decrease our reliance on incarceration when it came to youth. But am I right there, or was it just not something?
What specifically are we talking about?
As opposed to macro level societal change and community support programs like Young Women's Freedom Center and stuff. So I would define alternative to incarceration as a solution that does not include lockup for a youth who has been adjudicated. Let's call it that. What's your view of that continuum and how to continue to move forward here? Yeah.
I think that those kinds of alternatives to incarceration are much better than incarceration, right? And one phrase that came up, I think Bart Lubau from Annie E. Casey was the first person I heard say it, was incremental abolition. So we're not going to have some moment where everyone sees the light and the walls come tumbling down. That's not how change happens in any arena.
Right.
But I do think that diversion and alternatives to incarceration are important, valuable, and actually played a key role in closing youth prisons, because I haven't found one instance of fully populated youth prison closing. What has happened in every single instance is that by using diversion, by using alternatives to incarceration, gradually the population of the institutions drops, and as the institution empties, it gets more expensive per capita to incarcerate each kid. And then you've got a much more politically palatable argument for closing them. So above and beyond their benefit to individual youth, these diversion and alternatives to incarceration have been key to closing these places. And I think that they are good and useful. And they're not what I want for my kid. So it's a journey. I had the opportunity to meet a chief probation officer the other day. And I think I can say it was Brian Ford from Alameda County, who's trying to do all kinds of things. For example, he's using the funds that have flowed from the closure of DJJ to send young people adjudicated on serious charges to HBCUs. And we talked about this. And I raised this question to him, and he said, I would never want my kids to get any kind of service or supports from probation. And I'm the probation chief. And I think most parents feel that way. But it's sort of a don't let the perfect be the enemy of the better scenario. I think maybe the negativity that you're picking up on is that in burning down the house, when I talked about, if not prison, what, I kind of fell into the rabbit hole of the so-called evidence-based programs, multisystemic therapy, functional family therapy. There's 4 or 5 interventions that have the formal stamp of having been studied enough that they're evidence-based.
Mhm.
But with the help of Jeffrey Butts at John Jay, what I came to understand is that each of these interventions focuses on the child and the family as the entire locus of the problem, and doesn't touch the question of what is the environment around that child and what are the social drivers of incarceration. So I think it's a both and.
Got it. That was good. That was very clarifying. You wrote a book in 2005-ish, 2015, 2025. What do you think the book you will write in 2035 will be about?
So at the moment, that's a little hard to imagine. But if I were to write another book, it's a big if, I think it would look at the question that you've been asking, which is what do safety, justice, accountability look like outside of carceral systems? And initially, I thought that that would be half of this book. I thought the first half would describe the movement, and the second half would really delve deeply into what communities were doing to foster those things from the ground up. The movement turned out to be so complex and fascinating and multifaceted that if I had done that, I would have had a 500-page book. So I touched on it in the last couple chapters, but yeah, I really would love to explore that because I think one of the biggest mistakes that you can make if you are advocating against mass incarceration is to ignore the question of crime and victimization. People are getting hurt out there, and it's not enough not just to incarcerate people. It's not enough for the kids. We need to want more for all of our kids than just not to be incarcerated. And it's not enough for victims of crime and communities impacted by violence. We really have to think about what it means to foster safety. So I think should I still be writing in 2035? I think that's what I'd want to explore.
That would be a really good book. I hope it doesn't take 10 years. I hope you get right on it. I know you already are working.
Yeah, that's the editor in you, John. I'll get that right to you.
All right, the book is called In Our Future, We Are Free, The Dismantling of the Youth Prison. I'll drop a link for anybody that wants to go and get this book, which they should do, in the show notes for this episode. Nell Bernstein, thanks for joining us on the Imprint Weekly Podcast.
Such a pleasure.
Thanks to journalist Nell Bernstein, author of the new book, In Our Future, We Are Free, for joining us today. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is a production of the Safe Camp Audio Network, which is a division of Fostering Media Connections. Please visit safecamp.org on the web or at Safecamp Audio on all major social media. This podcast is produced and mixed by Christine Anjoko, with music by Luke Giroux and Cyrus Elia. If you enjoyed this episode, we would love it if you would consider subscribing or giving us a 5-star rating on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you download your podcasts. And we would greatly appreciate if you consider supporting our work here on the podcast and in print. Small donations from our listeners and readers go a long way towards helping us grow and cover more great stories in child welfare and youth justice. To support us, it is very easy. Just visit imprintnews.org/donate. You can follow The Imprint on Twitter and Facebook by searching the handle @TheImprintNews, and you can visit us on the web at imprintnews.org, and you can always get us over email at tips@imprintnews.org. I'm John Kelly, and we'll see you next week.